Mike didn't return to the valley with any sense of triumph. There was no moment of standing tall at the gate, no quiet smile of victory, just dust rising under the tires of his truck and the long stretch of land opening up in front of him like it had been waiting too long to ask questions. The ranch looked smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was just seeing it clearly for the first time. The front gate leaned to one side, its hinge whining when he pushed it open. Fence posts sagged, some barely holding on. The barn roof dipped in the middle like an old man's shoulders, weather-beaten and tired. Weeds had claimed the corral, tall and stubborn, as if the land had learned how to survive without permission. This was what his parents had left him. Not a legacy polished and ready, just ground, work, silence. Mike cut the engine and sat there longer than necessary, one hand resting on the steering wheel. The air smelled dry, familiar, sun-warmed dirt, old wood, a trace of iron from the soil. He hadn't come back chasing nostalgia. He'd come back because someone had to take responsibility, and his name was the one written on the papers. That was the truth of it. He stepped out of the truck and walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching over gravel and brittle grass. Each step felt heavier than it should have, not because the work scared him, but because staying meant something different than leaving ever had. Back when he'd driven away, he'd told himself the land would always be here. Now he wasn't so sure. The first few days passed in sweat and quiet frustration, tools that hadn't been touched in years, pipes that groaned when water finally ran through them, a windmill that turned only when it felt like it. Mike worked until his shoulders burned and his palms blistered, stopping only when the sun dipped low enough to remind him the day had ended. At night, the ranch settled into a stillness that felt almost watchful. On the third morning, fog clung low to the ground, thin and pale. Mike stood near the fence line with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, staring out over land that didn't yet feel like it belonged to him. That's when he noticed movement to the east. A figure walked along the neighboring property, unhurried. A woman wrapped in a light jacket, hair pulled back, moving with the kind of ease that came from knowing the land didn't need to be rushed. Laura. He hadn't expected to see her so soon. Or maybe he had, just hadn't admitted it to himself. She stopped when she noticed him. No surprise crossed her face. No hesitation either. Just a brief pause, then a small nod, like they'd passed each other yesterday instead of years ago. Mike lifted his chin in return. That was all. She didn't walk over, didn't call out. And somehow that felt right. Laura had lived on that stretch of land for as long as he could remember. Long before fences had been repaired and broken again. Long before people decided what stayed and what disappeared. She wasn't someone who announced herself. She didn't need to. The fog thinned as the sun climbed. Laura turned back toward her place, her steps steady, unbothered by Mike's presence or absence. And for reasons he couldn't name, Mike felt something settle in his chest. The days that followed took on a rhythm, wake before the heat, fix what could be fixed, make notes about what couldn't. The land resisted him, not aggressively, just honestly. It demanded patience, not force. Once, while he wrestled with a stubborn section of fencing, Laura appeared on the other side of the line, holding a thermos. "You're fighting it," she said, not unkindly. Mike paused, catching his breath. "Feels like that's all I've been doing." She gestured toward the post. "Try setting it when the ground cools. Late afternoon. It'll hold better." That was it. No lecture, no claim of authority, just knowledge offered and left alone. He watched her walk away again, realizing she hadn't waited to see if he'd listen. That night, Mike sat on the steps of the farmhouse, dirt under his nails, muscles aching in that deep, earned way. The ranch was still rough, still half forgotten, but it no longer felt abandoned. He understood something then, slow and clear. Taking over the ranch wasn't about ownership. It wasn't even about saving it. It was about learning how to stand on this land again without expecting it to bend to him. And somewhere just beyond the fence line, Laura lived her life the same way the land did. Quiet, grounded, unchanged by the need to prove anything. Mike stared out into the dark, listening to the wind move through dry grass. For the first time since he'd returned, he didn't feel like a man passing through. He felt like someone who might eventually belong. The work did not get easier just because Mike stayed. Each morning began the same way. Boots on, hands sore before the day had properly started, the sun climbing higher than he expected. He tried to impose order on the ranch the way he had learned elsewhere. Straight lines, strict timing, efficiency drilled into muscle memory. He measured, marked, adjusted. And still the land resisted him. Posts loosened overnight. Water pooled where it shouldn't. A section of ground that looked firm swallowed his boot to the ankle without warning. The ranch wasn't broken. It just wasn't interested in being commanded. That realization came slowly, the way exhaustion settles into bones. On one of those mornings when frustration pressed heavier than the heat, Laura appeared at the fence line with a small thermos in her hand. Mike hadn't heard her approach. He rarely did. "You're working against the wind today," she said, offering the thermos without ceremony. Mike hesitated, then took it. Coffee. Strong. Black. Still hot. "Didn't notice," he admitted. She nodded toward the trees at the far end of the property. "It shifts around mid-morning, comes down the slope instead of across it. That corner floods every spring if you don't give it room." He followed her gaze, seeing the land differently than he had an hour before. "That explains a lot." Laura didn't smile. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just leaned her weight against the fence, looking out like the answer had always been there. From then on, she showed up in small, practical ways. A comment about where frost lingered longest. A reminder to check the old irrigation line before trusting it. Once, she traced a path in the dirt with the toe of her boot, explaining where the water used to run before someone tried to straighten it years back. "The land remembers," she said simply. What struck Mike wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't. She never asked where he'd gone, never asked why he came back now. No curiosity disguised as politeness. No careful probing masked as neighborly concern. The silence around his past unsettled him at first. Most people ask questions to place you somewhere. Laura didn't seem to need that. At night, Mike found himself thinking about it more than he wanted to admit. About how easy it felt to be around someone who didn't expect a story. Someone who took him at face value, dusty boots and all. Their conversations stayed small, intentional. A few words exchanged while working. Brief pauses filled with understanding instead of explanations. They talked about weather patterns, about how many calves the neighboring ranch had lost the year before, about the way the valley emptied out when jobs dried up. "People don't leave because they hate it here," Laura said once, watching the horizon darken. "They leave because staying asks more of them than they're ready to give." Mike didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew that truth in his own way. Some afternoons, Laura would pass by with a slow nod and nothing else. Other days, she'd stop long enough to share a warning or a quiet observation, then continue on. She never lingered, never waited for him to fill the space. And somehow, that absence of pressure allowed something else to grow. Mike noticed the ranch responding, not dramatically but honestly. Water settled where it should. Posts held better when he followed Laura's timing. The land didn't soften, but it stopped pushing back as hard. He began to adjust his pace without realizing it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, Mike sat on an overturned bucket near the barn, sweat cooling on his neck. Laura stood a short distance away, watching a line of birds settle along the fence. "You're not rushing it anymore," she said. He considered that. "Guess I figured out it wasn't going anywhere." "That's the trick," she replied. "Neither are you, if you let yourself stay." There was no challenge in her voice, no test. Just a statement, offered and left where it landed. She turned and walked back toward her place, boots crunching softly against the dirt. Mike stayed where he was, the weight of her words settling in slow and steady. For the first time since returning, the ranch didn't feel like a problem to solve. It felt like a place that would meet him halfway, if he learned how to stand still long enough to listen. And Laura, the neighbor who never asked about the past, remained just beyond the fence line. Present, observant, unmoved by the need for explanations. In a valley where so many had left, she stayed. So did the land. And day by day, so did Mike. It didn't happen all at once. Humility never does. It arrived in small corrections. Quiet moments when Mike realized the ranch didn't respond to effort alone. He could work from dawn until the light slipped off the hills, muscles tight and hands raw, and still come up short. The land wasn't impressed by endurance. It wasn't moved by plans sketched out on paper or schedules pinned to the wall of the barn. What it asked for was attention. Mike began to notice the signs he'd been stepping past. The way the soil changed color where water once lingered. How grass leaned slightly downhill, as if remembering an old path. How birds avoided certain stretches of fence like they knew something he didn't. None of it was loud. All of it mattered. Laura never announced lessons. She didn't correct him in front of mistakes or stand over his shoulder. She waited until failure had finished speaking, then offered a sentence or two, nothing more. "You hear that?" she asked one afternoon as they stood near the lower pasture. Mike paused, listening. Wind through dry grass. The soft creak of the fence. Somewhere distant, a hawk cried out. "That ground's still holding moisture," she said. "If it were dry, it'd sound hollow under your boots." He shifted his weight, pressed down, felt the give he'd ignored all morning. "I was about to bring the tractor through," she nodded. "Tomorrow would have been better." Not "don't do it, just wait." That difference settled into him deeper than advice ever had. Some afternoons they found themselves sitting on the old fence that ran along the boundary between their properties. The boards were worn smooth by time, nails rusted, wood softened by decades of sun and snow. It wasn't a comfortable place, but it felt right. They sat there as the day cooled, watching the sky turn copper and gold. Neither of them rushed the moment. There were no stories offered for approval, no explanations demanded. Mike liked that the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Once he broke it. "I used to think if you worked hard enough, the rest would follow." Laura glanced at him, then back at the horizon. "Sometimes it does," she said. "Sometimes it just teaches you where you're wrong." He smiled at that. Not because it was clever, but because it was true. Over the next weeks, Mike changed the way he moved through the ranch. Slower steps, fewer assumptions. He checked the sky before making plans. Waited for the ground to tell him when it was ready. When something failed, he didn't force it into submission. He stepped back. The land responded, not with generosity, but with cooperation. Fences held. Water settled into channels that made sense. Grass came back where he'd stopped fighting it. The ranch didn't soften, it didn't forgive, but it stopped pushing him away. One evening, after a long day that left him bone-tired in the best possible way, Mike leaned against the fence beside Laura. The sun slipped behind the hills, pulling shadows long across the valley. "You're learning," she said. He shrugged. "Feels like I'm unlearning more than anything." "That's usually how it goes," she replied. He thought about that long after she left. That night, sitting on the farmhouse steps, Mike understood something he hadn't known how to name before. He hadn't been rejected by the land when he returned. He'd just arrived too loud, too certain of his right to take charge. Belonging, he realized, wasn't claimed. It was granted. Slowly, on its own terms. The next day, he left a section of fence unfinished when the ground told him to stop. He didn't push through the discomfort. He didn't justify it to himself. He trusted the pause. Laura noticed. They didn't talk about it. As the weeks stretched on, the evenings grew longer. The valley filled with that familiar western quiet. Crickets starting early, wind moving low, the sky widening into something that made small worries feel even smaller. Mike sat on the fence one evening after Laura had gone back to her place, watching the last light drain from the hills. He felt tired, yes, but grounded in a way he hadn't felt in years. Some places didn't greet you with open arms. They watched. They waited. And if you stayed long enough, if you learned how to listen instead of lead, they let you in. Mike rested his hands on the worn wood and breathed in the cooling air. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man trying to prove himself to the land. He felt like someone being quietly accepted. The ranch didn't change overnight. Nothing worth keeping ever did. But little by little, the signs were there. Grass came back where dust had ruled. Water stopped arguing with the pipes and began to move the way it was meant to. Steady, patient, reliable. The cattle returned in small numbers at first, cautious as if they remembered being let down before. Then they settled, hooves pressing paths into the earth that felt intentional instead of desperate. Mike noticed the difference most in the mornings. The land no longer felt stiff when he stepped onto it. It met him where he was. The work still demanded effort, but it no longer pushed back with quiet resentment. He didn't feel like a trespasser anymore. He felt expected. Laura worked beside him more often now, though neither of them ever said so out loud. She didn't arrive with instructions or leave with checklists. She just showed up when something needed doing and stepped away when it didn't. There were no conversations about who decided what. No need for it. They moved in parallel, not in step, but close enough to understand each other's pace. Some days they repaired fence lines together, hands moving in practiced silence. Other days, Laura worked her side of the land while Mike tended his, both aware of the other's presence without watching for it. They shared tools when needed. Water, shade, a nod now and then. The closeness that formed between them didn't announce itself. It wasn't dramatic. It grew the way the ranch did. Quiet, functional, earned through repetition. Mike found himself measuring days not by what he finished, but by what held. A gate that didn't sag, a trough that stayed full, an evening that didn't feel rushed. One night, after the heat had finally broken, they sat near the horse barn as dusk settled in. The animals shifted softly inside, the sound of breathing and movement steady and calm. A faint smell of hay and dust lingered in the air. They didn't sit close enough to touch. They didn't need to. Mike leaned back against a post, arms resting loosely at his sides. Laura sat on an overturned bucket, boots planted, gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light faded. "People think leaving takes courage," she said after a while. Mike didn't turn toward her, but he listened. "Doesn't it?" "Sometimes," she replied. "But staying asks for something too. Patience, endurance, a willingness to be seen exactly where you are." Heidi, the quiet stretch between them. Mike thought about the men he'd known who left and never looked back. Thought about how easy it was to call that freedom. "Staying feels heavier," he said. Laura nodded. "Because it is. You're choosing the wait instead of the escape." Mike let that sit. He didn't argue. He didn't feel the need to defend himself. The land had already answered the question for him in ways words couldn't. He watched a horse shift its weight inside the barn, the soft sound of hooves against wood grounding him in the moment. "I didn't come back because I wanted to," he said quietly. "At least not at first." Laura glanced over then, her expression open, unguarded. She didn't ask what changed. "I stayed," Mike continued, "because it stopped fighting me once I stopped fighting it." A faint smile touched her mouth. "That's how you know you're listening." The night cooled further. Crickets began their steady chorus. Somewhere beyond the barn, wind moved through grass that had grown tall enough to answer back. They sat there until the stars came out one by one, neither of them checking the time. Mike realized something then, not suddenly but clearly. What he felt with Laura wasn't attraction built on mystery or longing. It wasn't the sharp pull of wanting something out of reach. It was familiarity, trust, the comfort of shared silence and parallel effort. Their closeness came from the days they'd spent working without keeping score, from knowing neither of them was trying to lead the other. Later, as Laura stood to leave, she paused. "You've brought this place back," she said. Mike shook his head. "No, it met me halfway." She accepted that answer without comment, then walked back toward her land, her figure gradually swallowed by the dark. Mike stayed where he was a moment longer, listening to the ranch settle for the night. The rhythm had returned, not just to the land, but to him. And in the spaces between words, between work and rest, between effort and acceptance, he understood something simple and unshakable. Belonging didn't arrive with noise. It came with silence. The storm came in the late afternoon, quiet at first, the way these things often did. The sky darkened without warning, clouds stacking low and heavy over the valley. Wind moved through the grass in uneven waves, bending what had only recently learned how to stand tall again. Mike had just finished securing the last gate when the first crack of thunder rolled through the hills. By nightfall, the power was gone. No lights in the farmhouse, no hum from the pump. Just rain tapping against tin and wood, steady and patient. Mike lit a lantern, then another, but the glow felt small against the dark pressing in from all sides. He was stacking wood near the barn when he saw Laura crossing the yard. Jacket pulled tight, rain slicking her hair back from her face. "Figured you'd have a fire going," she said, raising her voice just enough to carry over the wind. "Was about to," Mike replied. They didn't discuss it further. Some things didn't need planning. They built the fire just inside the open barn doors, sheltered from the rain but close enough to hear it. Flames caught slowly, licking at the dry wood, then settling into a low, steady burn. The light it gave off was soft, uneven, warming the space without trying to claim it. They sat a few feet apart at first, boots stretched toward the heat, shadows moving across the walls behind them. The storm filled the silence for a while. Rain, wind, the distant sound of thunder losing its edge as it moved on. Laura was the first to speak. "I used to come out here with my grandfather," she said, eyes fixed on the fire. "Back when there were fewer fences. He'd say the land didn't belong to us. We belonged to it." Mike nodded. "Sounds like something the land would agree with." She smiled faintly. "He taught me where the ground held water, even in dry years. Said if you listened long enough, it'd tell you what it needed." The fire cracked softly. Mike shifted, feeling the warmth settle into his bones. "My folks weren't much for listening," he said. "They worked hard, but they always talked about leaving, bigger places, easier living." "Did you want that?" Laura asked, not turning to look at him. He considered the question longer than it deserved. "I thought I did," he said finally. "Turns out I just wanted to know what else was out there." The storm eased, rain softening to a low hiss. The fire became the loudest thing in the barn. Mike stared into it, watching sparks lift and disappear. "I moved around," he went on. "Picked up work where I could. Stayed places just long enough to know I didn't belong. Kept telling myself I was choosing freedom." Laura glanced at him then, her expression open, steady. She didn't interrupt. "Funny thing is," Mike continued, "the longer I stayed gone, the harder it got to sit still anywhere." Laura nodded. "Stillness takes practice." They fell quiet again. Not the kind of silence that waited to be filled, the kind that settled in, comfortable and earned. The fire burned lower. Mike added another log, careful not to break the moment. Laura shifted closer to the heat, close enough now that he could feel it reflecting off her jacket when the flames flared. She spoke again, voice softer. "I didn't think I'd stay either. Not forever. But somewhere along the way, leaving started to feel like I'd be abandoning something that hadn't wronged me." Mike understood that without needing to say so. They didn't confess anything that night. No declarations, no promises made in the flicker of firelight. They shared stories the way you shared tools, used, familiar, without ceremony. When the fire finally burned down to embers, the storm had moved on, leaving the night cool and clean. Mike stood, stretched, and offered Laura the lantern. She took it, their hands brushing briefly in the exchange. Neither of them reacted. They didn't need to. From that night on, something shifted. Not sharply, not loudly. They found themselves closer without deciding to be, working side by side more often, sitting longer at the end of the day, standing a little nearer when the light faded. Nothing was named, nothing needed to be. The land noticed, Mike thought, the way it always did, and under the quiet stars with the smell of smoke still clinging to the air, he realized closeness didn't always arrive with a rush. Sometimes it came the way fire did, small, steady, and warm enough to last. They didn't plan it. The idea came up the way weather did, quietly without ceremony. Mike was coiling a length of rope by the barn when Laura mentioned a road that cut west through low hills and dry towns that never stayed on maps for long. "Ever take it?" she asked. Mike shook his head. "Never had a reason." She considered that, then said, "Maybe that's reason enough." They left the next morning before the sun climbed too high. No packed schedule, no destination written down. Just Mike's truck, a half tank of gas, and the road stretching out like it didn't care where they ended up. The ranch disappeared behind them slowly, fences thinning, fields widening, the land opening into long, quiet miles. Windows down, wind moving through the cab. Neither of them talked much at first. It wasn't awkward, it was easy. They stopped when the truck needed gas. They stopped again when Laura spotted a diner with a crooked sign and a parking lot full of dust. Inside, the coffee was too strong, the pancakes heavy, the waitress friendly without asking questions. Nobody looked at them twice. Mike realized how rare that felt. By afternoon, they were passing through towns that seemed to exist only because the road passed through them. One main street, a hardware store that doubled as a post office, a closed movie theater with faded posters still clinging to the windows, places that didn't expect anything from you except to pass on through. They didn't rush. When the day wore thin, they pulled into a motel on the edge of nowhere. Neon flickered over a sign missing 2 letters. Gravel crunched under the tires. The office smelled like old carpet and cleaner that tried too hard. "One room left," the clerk said, sliding the key across the counter without looking up. Laura glanced at Mike. Not a question, just acknowledgement. The room was small, 1 bed, a narrow table by the window, curtains that didn't quite close. The air conditioner rattled when they turned it on, then settled into a tired hum. Neither of them spoke about it. They set their bags down, took turns in the shower, moved around each other without urgency, without hesitation. When they finally lay down, it wasn't with the sharp pull of wanting or the need to claim something before it slipped away. It was calm. Mike lay on his back, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. Laura rested on her side facing him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the thin sheet. "This isn't escape," she said softly. "No," Mike agreed. "It's a pause." She smiled at that, barely. Her hand rested between them, not reaching, just there. After a moment, Mike covered it with his own. The contact felt natural, unforced. They didn't hurry. They didn't take. They stayed present, attentive to the space they shared. When they moved closer, it was gradual, guided by trust rather than need. The night held them gently, like it wasn't asking anything more. Later, when the lights were off and the room had gone quiet except for the hum of the unit and the sound of distant trucks on the highway, Mike realized he wasn't thinking about tomorrow, or the ranch, or what this meant. He was thinking only about now, and how enough it felt. Morning came slow. Sunlight slipped through the gap in the curtains, pale and forgiving. Laura woke first, sitting up on the edge of the bed, pulling on one of Mike's shirts without comment. She stood by the window for a while, watching the empty parking lot. Mike joined her, coffee cups in hand, the kind brewed in a small machine that never quite got it right. They drank in silence, shoulders nearly touching. They checked out without ceremony. No promises made, no future discussed. On the drive back, the road felt shorter, familiar even though it wasn't. They talked more now, about nothing important. A song on the radio, a billboard that made Laura laugh, the way the light changed when clouds passed over the hills. When the ranch finally came back into view, Mike felt no weight settle in his chest. No regret about returning, only a steady calm. The trip hadn't been about leaving. It hadn't been about finding something new. It had been about realizing that for now, being side by side was enough. And as Mike turned onto the familiar dirt road, Laura sitting quiet beside him, he knew they hadn't gone anywhere to escape. They'd gone to listen, and they'd come back exactly when they were meant to. The man arrived without noise. No engine revved too loud. No dust cloud announced him. His truck rolled up the drive late one afternoon, clean in a way that didn't belong out here, stopping short of the house like it wasn't sure it had the right to come any closer. Mike noticed it first from the barn. He didn't recognize the truck, and that alone was enough to make him pause. The ranch had grown familiar again. Every sound, every rhythm. This one didn't fit. Laura stepped out of her place moments later. She stopped when she saw the man waiting by his door. Didn't wave. Didn't smile, just stood there, shoulders squared, like she had already decided something before a word was spoken. Mike stayed where he was. He wiped his hands on his jeans, leaned against the fence rail, and watched without moving closer. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that stepping in would change the shape of the moment. The man said her name, quietly, as if saying it louder might cost him something. Laura didn't correct him. She didn't invite him closer either. They spoke for a few minutes. Mike couldn't hear the words, only the tone, measured, careful, edged with something old. The kind of conversation that carried history without ever naming it. The man gestured once, palms open, as if offering explanation. Laura listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fold in on herself the way people sometimes did when confronted with their past. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't soften either. She said very little. And when she was done, she turned and walked back toward her place without looking over her shoulder. The man stood there a moment longer, then got back into his truck. Tires rolled slowly over gravel, the sound fading sooner than Mike expected. The ranch exhaled. Later that evening, Laura crossed the fence line the way she always did, unannounced but welcome. The light was low, the air cooling fast. Mike was repairing a latch, movements steady, deliberate. She stopped a few feet away. "You didn't come over." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Mike nodded. "Didn't seem like you needed me to." She studied him for a moment, as if measuring something unseen. Then she sat on the fence rail, hands folded loosely in her lap. "I used to think moments like that meant I was about to lose myself," she said. "Like everything I'd built would crack if I wasn't careful." Mike waited. "He didn't yell," she continued. "Didn't threaten. He never did. He just reminded me of who I used to be when I thought shrinking was the same thing as peace." Mike felt something tighten in his chest, but he didn't let it pull him toward anger or protection. He stayed where he was. "You didn't shrink today," he said. Laura shook her head, a quiet certainty in the movement. "No, I didn't." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was clean. "I think I finally understand the difference," she went on, "between being saved and being respected." Mike looked at her then. "You were never something that needed saving." She met his gaze, steady and calm. "I know, and you never treated me like I was." That mattered more than any confrontation could have. They didn't dissect the past. They didn't name the man or linger on what he represented. The shadow had passed through, touched the ground briefly, and moved on. What remained was different. They stood side by side as the sky darkened, not close enough to touch, not far enough to feel distant. The ranch settled around them, familiar sounds returning, the low shift of animals, wind moving through grass, the steady quiet of a place that had weathered worse. Mike realized then that his role hadn't been to shield Laura from her past. It had been to give her space to stand in front of it without losing herself. And Laura understood something too. The strength she felt now hadn't come from learning how to endure. It had come from being seen clearly and left whole. As she turned to leave, she paused. "Thank you," she said simply. Mike nodded. "Anytime." She walked back toward her place, her stride unbroken, her silhouette steady against the fading light. The past had come and gone. It hadn't taken anything with it. And what remained between them felt stronger, not because it had been tested, but because it hadn't needed to be defended. The days after the past passed through were quieter than before. Not tense, not fragile, just honest. Laura didn't pull away, and she didn't move closer either. She stayed exactly where she had been, grounded, present, unchanged by the need to explain herself. Mike noticed that more than anything. The way she moved through her days with the same steady rhythm, as if the shadow that had crossed the land hadn't left a mark worth carrying. One late afternoon, when the heat had softened into something bearable, Laura crossed over with a folded piece of paper in her hand. Mike was mending a section of fence that no longer leaned the way it used to. She didn't speak right away, just stood there, watching him work. "You ever think about what you'd do," she said finally, "if you didn't have to prove anything to anyone?" Mike wiped his hands on a rag. "I think that's what I'm trying to figure out now." She nodded, like that answer gave her permission to continue. She unfolded the paper, smoothing it against her knee. It wasn't neat, edges worn, creases softened by time. "I used to write things down," she said, "back when I thought leaving was the only way to breathe." Mike leaned against the post, listening. "I wanted a place," Laura continued, eyes on the horizon. "Not a business the way people usually mean it. More like a pause, somewhere quiet, books, warm drinks, chairs that didn't rush you out the door. A place where nobody expected you to explain why you needed to sit for a while." She laughed softly, not embarrassed, just aware of how long it had been. "I used to think it was unrealistic, that dreams like that were for people who didn't have roots." Mike didn't interrupt. He waited until she finished. "Then life happened," she said. "Responsibilities, expectations, the quiet kind of discouragement that tells you not to ask for more than what's already in front of you." She folded the paper again, slower this time. "I stopped thinking about it, told myself it was childish." Mike watched her hands. The care she took was something she claimed she'd let go of. "When did you stop wanting it?" he asked. Laura considered the question. I didn't, she admitted. I just stopped believing it had a place to land. Mike nodded once. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Are you ready to start? Laura looked at him, surprised. Not by the words, but by the absence of everything else. No offer to build it for her. No reassurance wrapped in promises. Just the question, plain and steady. I don't know how, she said. You didn't know how to stay either, Mike replied. You figured that out. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was full. That night, Laura sat at her kitchen table long after the light outside faded. She spread the paper out in front of her and added to it. Names, half-formed ideas, little notes about how she wanted the place to feel, not how it should look. Mike didn't hover. He didn't ask to see it. When she told him what she'd written, he listened like it mattered, and then let it be hers. Over the next weeks, the dream began to breathe again. Laura walked the land differently now, not searching, but noticing. She talked about corners of town that stayed quiet even during the busiest hours, about old buildings that held more memory than dust, about how some places didn't need fixing, just patience. Mike watched the change in her with quiet respect. She stood taller, laughed more easily, spoke about the future without bracing herself for disappointment. One evening, as they sat near the barn watching the light drain from the valley, Laura said, You never tried to take this from me. Mike frowned slightly. Why would I? She smiled then, not softly but with clarity. Most people don't mean to. They just make your dreams smaller without realizing it. He considered that. Seems like a waste. She nodded. It is. The ranch settled around them, steady and familiar. Crickets sang. Wind moved low through grass that had learned how to grow again. Laura folded her arms loosely, looking out over land that no longer felt like something she had to defend. I think I'm ready, she said. Not all at once. Just ready to begin. Mike didn't congratulate her. He didn't mark the moment with anything larger than it needed to be. Good, he said. Beginnings tend to like that. Laura breathed out, slow and unburdened. That night, as she walked back toward her place, she carried the paper with her, not as a relic, but as something alive again. And Mike understood something clear and steady. Love hadn't brought her dream back. Respect had. And sometimes that was the most powerful kind of space anyone could offer. The letter arrived on a Thursday, folded once too many times into a box that already held more bills than hope. Mike found it in the mailbox after a long morning repairing a stretch of fencing that had finally learned how to stay upright. The envelope was heavier than the rest. Thick paper, official without trying to impress. His name sat centered on the front like it had nowhere else to be. He didn't open it right away. He carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and washed his hands as if the dirt under his nails might cloud his thinking. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from a place being lived in again. When he finally unfolded the letter, he read it twice. Then a third time, slower. An offer, not charity, not nostalgia. A real proposition tied to the land, adjacent acreage coming up for sale, a chance to expand, consolidate water rights, modernize without tearing the place apart. There were options listed, each one leading somewhere different. Growth, sale, partnership, or walking away with enough money to start over somewhere else. The letter didn't tell him what to do. It just asked. Mike sat there a long while, the paper resting against the wood grain of the table, feeling the weight of a future that didn't belong to anyone else to decide. He didn't go looking for Laura that day. That night, he left the letter where it was and stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars sharp and steady. The ranch settled around him, familiar sounds grounding him where he stood. Laura came by later, as she often did, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She noticed the envelope immediately. She always noticed. Good news? She asked, her voice even. Big news, Mike said. She sat across from him without reaching for the letter. Want to talk about it? He slid it toward her. She read it once, carefully, then set it back between them. That's a lot, she said. It is. They didn't rush the moment. Steam curled from their mugs. Somewhere in the distance, an animal shifted, then went still again. Whatever you decide, Laura said finally, don't do it because you think you owe something to anyone. Mike studied her face. looking for the quiet fear he half expected to find. It wasn't there. "You're not asking me to stay," he said. She shook her head. "I'm not asking you to go either." The simplicity of it caught him off guard. "I don't want to be the reason you shrink your life," she continued, "and I don't want to be the excuse you use to run from it." Mike felt something ease in his chest. Not relief, clarity. They talked through the options without turning them into arguments. What expansion would mean. What selling could free him from. What leaving would cost. Laura listened, asked questions that sharpened his thinking, never once steering the conversation toward herself. At one point, Mike said quietly, "If I go, this changes things." "Yes," Laura agreed. "It does." She didn't soften the truth. She didn't dramatize it either. "But it doesn't erase what's real," she added. They sat with that for a while. Mike realized then how different this felt from the choices he'd made before. There was no urgency pulling him toward escape, no pressure to prove something by staying, just a decision, waiting to be made honestly. "This is what grown love looks like," he said, more to himself than to her. Laura smiled faintly. "It usually doesn't look like much from the outside." He laughed under his breath. "No fireworks." "No," she said, "just room to breathe." Later, after Laura had gone back to her place, Mike picked up the letter again. He read it one last time, not for information, but for feeling. He tried to imagine choosing each path and noticed which ones asked him to abandon himself. That told him more than numbers ever could. When he folded the letter and set it aside, he didn't feel resolved, but he felt grounded. He knew the choice wouldn't come from fear or obligation. It would come from listening, to the land, to the quiet, to himself, and to Laura, who had shown him that love didn't demand sacrifice as proof. It trusted you to choose freely. As the night deepened, Mike stepped out onto the porch again, the stars watching in their patient way. For the first time, he understood that some of the strongest bonds weren't built by holding tight. They were built by letting go, just enough to allow truth to stand on its own. Mike left the way he had learned to do most things on the ranch, without noise. There was no gathering at the gate, no long goodbyes stretched thin by promises neither of them was ready to make. The truck was packed light, the engine turned over once, steady and familiar. Morning sat low over the valley, pale and calm, as if the land itself had decided not to interfere. He walked the fence line one last time before leaving. Posts stood straight, gates held. Water moved where it was meant to go. The ranch breathed on its own now, not dependent on constant correction, not fragile. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive, and that felt like enough. Laura watched from her side of the fence. She didn't wave. She didn't step closer. She simply stood there, hands tucked into her jacket, eyes clear, grounded in the place that had always known her. They shared a look across the distance, one that didn't ask for reassurance or demand explanation. Just acknowledgement. Mike nodded once. Laura returned it. That was all. The truck rolled down the dirt road, tires pressing a path that would fade by afternoon. The ranch didn't shrink behind him. It remained, solid and unchanged by his leaving. Laura turned back toward her place as the sound of the engine disappeared. She had work to do. The dream she'd carried for so long no longer felt fragile. It lived in small actions now, sketches spread across her table, conversations with people who lingered longer than necessary, quiet measurements of spaces that might hold stillness without trying to sell it. She moved through her days with intention, not urgency. The land recognized that. Weeks passed, then more. The ranch continued its slow recovery. Grass thickened, animals settled into routine. Neighbors noticed, though no one said much. Good work, done right, rarely needed comment, and Mike, wherever the road took him, carried the land with him in ways he hadn't expected. He found himself watching how ground held water in unfamiliar places, noticing wind before it shifted, choosing silence more often than noise. He no longer felt the need to explain where he came from or where he was headed. Some nights he stood on porches that weren't his and looked up at skies that felt close enough to touch. He thought of Laura, not with longing that ached, but with a steadiness that warmed. She hadn't asked him to stay. He hadn't promised to return. And somehow that made what they shared feel real enough to survive distance. One evening, Laura sat alone outside, a candle burning low beside her. The valley hummed softly around her, familiar and patient. She opened her notebook and crossed out a line she'd written years ago, replacing it with something simpler. Begin where you are. She smiled, closed the book, and let the quiet settle. There are stories that end with reunions, with certainty wrapped in neat conclusions. This wasn't one of them. This story ended with two people standing firmly in their own lives, changed not by possession or sacrifice, but by respect. The land was no longer wild, and neither were they. What remained was a question, gentle and unforced, left hanging in the wide western air. Are their bonds strong enough to be whole, even when they don't insist on staying side by side? The valley didn't answer. It never had. It simply endured.